Hi everybody, welcome here, and I'm glad you all came out after a long holiday weekend and all of that, but very happy to have you here at Cure. And I think most of you, many of you anyway, have been to Cure, but we've been around for a few months and we're holding events like this pretty much every week, sometimes even more than one. And so very happy to have you here. It's all about healthcare, kind of the future, cutting edge. And we do these different topics, including our Tuesday talks, which happen to fall on most Tuesdays. So I'm very, very pleased tonight. Oh, and by the way, I should probably say, you maybe didn't expect me to be here. Those of you who come to these, usually our CEO, Seema Kumar, is the moderator of these, but I got a call around 1 o'clock. Unfortunately, Seema has injured her knee. And so I think she might be out of the ER now, but hopefully she's okay. Anyway, she didn't make it in. And I'm David Ewing Duncan, and I'm the creative director here at Cure. I also am a journalist and an author and do a lot of talks around on healthcare topics. So I'm very pleased to have Ilana Golant here, and you just saw her speaking on the video. She is I don't know, Ilana, you do so many things. You're in PR, you're in marketing, you're a lawyer, but we're really here to talk about, I guess you called it, it's the passion of your life, even though it's not, you don't work full-time on this because you do have other jobs. But she's the founder and CEO of the Food Allergy Fund. And so we're here to talk about something. I've already had a number of you come up and say, I'm really excited about this. Or maybe excited is the wrong word, but I'm very interested in this because food allergies, either you have them or they run in your family. And I think many of us have had these experiences. It's happened in my family as well. And there's a lot of mystery around food allergies. You know, why do they happen? You know, suddenly you might be fine eating avocados and then suddenly not. And they can also be, as Ilana was just pointing out as we were chatting, they can be extraordinarily dangerous too. And so, you know, what's going on with that? And Ilana happens to have in her family a daughter who has several food allergies. And so I want to hear from you how you started the Food Allergy Fund, but maybe we could start with that. Tell us, you know, your personal story, if you don't mind, and how you ended up starting this organization.
Great, well, thank you so much for having me here today. I have a 7-year-old daughter with multiple life-threatening food allergies. She had her first anaphylactic reaction at 13 months old. It was one fine Sunday afternoon, and I had never seen an allergic reaction, didn't know that you could eat a food repeatedly and be fine, and then suddenly be allergic to it. And so my husband and I are both lawyers by training. We sat there kind of arguing with each other for 30 to 45 seconds while her eyes were swollen shut, full body hives, projectile vomit, and we quickly realized something's really, really wrong. And so that was my introduction to food allergy. Until that Sunday afternoon, I kind of knew about food allergies out there, but really had no awareness, no understanding of how widespread they are and how dangerous they are. And so at the time we were living in New York, we then moved to DC over a period of about 6 months, between 13 months and 19 months, she just tacked on food after food after food. And we were seeing excellent doctors in New York and in Washington, and they were disagreeing on her standard of care. And so here I was as a parent, choosing my own adventure. I mean, there were these kids' books when I was growing up, Choose Your Own Adventure. That's what the food allergy journey felt like for me as a family, a parent, and for all the families that I've interacted with. It's kind of choose your own adventure. There's no known cause, there's no good diagnostics, there's no therapeutics, and so you kind of have to figure it out on your own. And so I decided, well, I can't figure it out. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but what can I do to help figure this out? And so the lawyer in me kind of spent 6 months looking at other disease state organizations, cystic fibrosis, juvenile diabetes, autism, the American Cancer Society, to understand how research has been accelerated in other areas and how we can apply those learnings to food allergies. Instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, kind of take another disease playbook and apply it to food allergy. And so that was the genesis of the organization. Launched it a few years ago, shortly before COVID, and set about developing a scientific advisory board that would be truly a who's who center of excellence. I wanted the leading brain trust thinking about this and approaching it from many different angles. And so I came up with my wish list of 15 doctors, scientists at top institutions across the country and started cold calling them and saying, I have this vision, will you join me? And they universally said yes, because food allergy is grossly underfunded relative to the patient population size. It's now 1 in 13 kids in the US, 1 in 10 adults. Globally, the population is estimated to be 450 million people. My guess is that number is actually significantly higher. The population studies that have been done haven't been updated in nearly a decade. And anecdotally, kind of in the time that I've been involved in this space, it feels like the number is going up and up and up and up with no end in sight whatsoever for kids and adults alike. So that's kind of how we got started.
I mean, the numbers are extraordinary. And, you know, there's clearly something going on out there. And I'm going to talk more about, you know, what some of the causes may be. But maybe you have some slides to share on some of these statistics.
Sure. So this is a little bit about our mission, as I mentioned, kind of accelerating research funding. But in terms of the statistics, I'll just take so this is kind of how we've approached it. How do we think about from all the disciplines that need to have a seat at the table? You can see the list here. It is extensive, it is comprehensive, and there are probably other disciplines that aren't even represented on our scientific advisory board, but we're really trying to tackle this from a collaborative, multidisciplinary perspective. So we have psychologists and clinicians, immunobiologists, microbiologists, chemical engineers, all of them thinking through this problem collectively. So in terms of the patient population, it's not working. There we go. It's now 1 in 13 kids in America. And as I mentioned, that number hasn't been updated in a decade. Recently, there was a new study that found 48% of children are allergic to more than 4 foods. So when I was growing up, seldom you would find, you know, kind of the peanut allergic child. I have not encountered a peanut allergic child in the 4 years that I've been doing this. The list is always quite lengthy. My personal list is quite lengthy, but really it's 4 plus is now kind of the average and growing by the day. For adults, 1 in 10 adults in the US now have food allergies. And so, you know, I got started because of my daughter, and this is my passion. My goal is to find a cure for her and for the millions of others of children and adults suffering from this. But it's affecting adults. And, you know, I developed an allergy recently as well, and it's happening in people's, once you kind of hit 40, 45, food allergies are skyrocketing. Why? No one knows. And so as both the pediatric and the adult population skyrocket, we really need to do something about it. The economic impact is also staggering. There's kind of the direct medical costs of the ER visit. Every 3 minutes in America, someone is admitted to the emergency room with an anaphylactic reaction. Every 3 minutes. That is a very high number. Food allergies are treatment is basically not covered by insurance at this point. We can talk about diagnostics in a little bit, but kind of the gold standard of diagnostics, which is highly flawed for a variety of reasons, often is not covered by insurance as well. And so the economic impact on families who don't have the resources to get diagnosed, let alone treat the condition, is staggering. And the economic impact is pretty significant. It's also disproportionately affecting food allergy moms who drop out of the workforce to manage their children's food allergies. You know, I work full time. It is a daily kind of additional work-life balance struggle, but the economic impact is significant. There's also really unique feature of food allergy in terms of kind of the multiplier effect. I joke that my 7-year-old daughter is our chief household officer. The airline that we fly, the hotel we stay at, the restaurant that we go to, the cereal we buy, everything that we consume as a household is dictated by my child. And that is true for every food allergy family. And so the consumer multiplier effect is so unique, unlike any other condition. If you're living with someone in your family, I mean, you kind of don't change things in the same way. And then I just we should touch kind of on the pediatric comorbidities. Food allergies are now increasingly presenting alongside other conditions: asthma, autism, EOE, FPIES. EOE and FPIES are two diseases that didn't even have a name 20 years ago, 15 years ago. They weren't classified by the NIH. They are now very much classified, and I can say anecdotally, more and more families are dealing not only with IgE-mediated food allergy, but other food-related autoimmune conditions. And at its core, that's what food allergies are, right? They're an autoimmune disease. They're not a lifestyle choice. They're not the product of a poor diet or helicopter parenting or kind of many of these myths that I often hear that are really frustrating as a parent. But it's an autoimmune disease, and it's a life-threatening one.
No, thank you. That's really startling. I'm wondering, in the audience here, how many of you either have food allergies yourselves or in your family? So it's most of you. Okay. Is that pretty typical?
It is. I mean, we talked about kind of the percentages earlier, but I remember hosting my daughter's second birthday of 16 kids, random sampling, friends of mine from college, from law school, her preschool, the local playground, just a pure random sample of 16 kids, and 10 of them had food allergies, which is higher than kind of any population study. So seeing more than half the hands.
So those numbers are probably underestimates.
Oh, significantly.
Yeah, easily, probably, yeah. But that does lead to a question, though. I mean, it's sort of funny. I'm sure everybody's noticed. You go to a restaurant now, and they always ask you, do you have any food allergies? And I find that interesting. But I think there is a question, what exactly is a food allergy? I mean, there are people, like I think of lactose intolerance. I mean, I think you know pretty early in your life if you can't really drink milk, you just don't drink milk. I don't know, that might be one end of the spectrum, and I don't mean to, belittle that, because that can be a very bad issue as well. But I mean, there must be a spectrum, but what would you define as a food allergy?
Yeah, I mean, a food allergy is an hyper autoimmune response to a food, where the body thinks the food is a pathogen and goes into immune overdrive trying to fight it, trying to develop antibodies to fight it when we all need food to live. And so it's kind of this very unusual immune response that no one knows what causes it, why it's gone haywire. I mean, there are many theories about kind of a confluence of factors. My own gut on this is that there's 3 or 4 or 5 causes that kind of have culminated in this perfect storm that we now know as food allergy. They've skyrocketed in the past 20 years, especially, but kind of the trajectory has been on the upward swing for 30 to 40 years. Now it's kind of really hit a crescendo. But it's IgE mediated by the immune system. It is life-threatening. Lactose intolerance, celiac, I mean, these are other food-related autoimmune responses, but they are not life-threatening. And so that is a significant differentiating factor for food allergy as well. And as I mentioned, some of the comorbidities, EOE, FPIES, they're really, really difficult, unpleasant diseases to live with. And so when you have an allergic system that's grappling with multiple allergic diseases, that's another layer of patient management.
So, I mean, you talked a little bit about what the causes might be, but anything more that, like the science says? I mean, I've done more studying of autoimmune diseases, but that's obviously heavily related, and many autoimmune diseases are triggered by eating something. There's some other factors too that can play in, but I mean, is this to the point where there clearly is something going on? We don't know what it is, or do we have a clue?
We have a clue that something's going on. We don't know what it is,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there was one leading hypothesis, the hygiene hypothesis, that we're just too clean as a society. But that has been rapidly debunked, because if you look at areas of the world that are not as clean and sterile as the US, food allergy per capita rates are the same, if not higher. You look at Mexico City, high air pollution, food allergy is higher than in New York City, right? And so the hygiene hypothesis has been debunked to a certain extent. There are theories around kind of the microbiome going haywire, what has affected the gut, what has altered the gut. Is it food manufacturing? Is it the rise of C-section? Is it the rise of antibiotic use, especially in early childhood, the ear infection, strep throat? Well, what's causing those things? And so there's this domino effect of a variety of potential causes. There's no known cause, and at this point there isn't a leading kind of consensus around what that leading cause might be.
Yeah. I mean, we clearly there are new chemicals that come out almost every day, and it's in the food, it's in the air. I mean, we don't know what a lot of that's causing. I mean, it must be incredibly complex, though, whatever it is, and probably somewhat individualized, how people respond. But by the way, the list of the partners you have is unbelievably impressive. And you kind of came up here and said, yeah, I just started this organization. But I mean, that must have been not easy. And you must, I don't know if you talk about your funding, but it's also very hard to raise the kind of money to attract those researchers. I mean, although I guess some frustration among the research community as well. But talk about how you decide, you went out and studied other organizations, but what is the focus of your fund? I mean, it seems a lot of it's research, but how did you organize that, and what are you working on specifically?
Yeah, I mean, at its core, we're funding research, multidisciplinary research that will get us to a better understanding of the cause and therefore therapeutics, and in an ideal world, a cure. But if we can just stop anaphylaxis or reverse anaphylaxis, to me that is success. We don't necessarily need a cure. That is ideal, of course, but in terms of kind of the daily life experience of living with food allergies, anaphylaxis is what is truly kind of the most impactful, right? There's eczema, there's rashes, vomiting. You can deal with all that. But being a bite away at every social interaction, at every meal in school, whining and dining for a living as an adult, it really affects everything. So we're funding research. We fund research in two ways. We run open RFP processes where we send out an open RFP, and it is so intentionally open-ended because we want the best and brightest ideas from wherever they are. And then our scientific advisory board vets them, screens them, and scores them. And what has been really interesting to see is that in every RFP round, there's a clear consensus around the number one proposal in that batch, right? So that's kind of the project that is going to move the needle the most. I've now gotten to know the research community well enough and the science to predict, and my batting average is pretty good, of what kind of who the winner will be. So there's the open RFP process where we really just encourage the best and brightest thinking possible. And then the other piece of it is researchers coming to us directly and asking for funding for a specific project that they're working on. The NIH is critically important to scientific research generally. Allergy and infectious disease has been on a downward trajectory in terms of NIH funding, even as the patient population has skyrocketed. So you kind of have these two cross currents happening where philanthropy and nonprofits really need to step in the absence of federal funding. Compared to other diseases, the patient population is exponentially higher, and there's this inverse relationship between the food allergic patient population size vis-a-vis, and not to diminish any other condition, but there are diseases that have a patient population of 40, 50,000 people, and we have 32 million people, and the NIH funding is exponentially higher. And so research teams are desperate for funding, and especially for seed funding. So we play a really critical role in preclinical, early stage seed funding, where we can give $100,000, $500,000, $1 million grants that a research team can then go to the NIH and leverage more funding. But getting that seed funding is so critically important for food allergy and for many disease states. And there is kind of no other mechanism other than philanthropy. So we're really proud to play that role in accelerating that research.
So I'm curious, I mean, there's been a trend probably in the last 20 to 30 years, started the Michael J. Fox Foundation and some others, of people who have different conditions and diseases just getting frustrated with all that money being spent at the federal level especially, but it's mostly peer research, and they always tell you as patients, at least I've heard this from patients, just be patient. And you sound like you're
impatient.
Yeah, impatient. I mean, for good reason. But are you part of that movement? I mean, is that something you think about? And I guess you say they come to you for funding, so you are working to accelerate that funding for more immediate action, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're increasingly getting requests from abroad as well. I mean, we're a US-based nonprofit, but increasingly on a weekly basis, I get an email from, this week alone, the University of Tokyo, an institute in Austria, and an institute in Israel. How they're finding us, I mean, obviously that's the power of globalization, social media, connectivity, et cetera. But there's a lot of innovation and passion in the space. It really is a money problem, for lack of a better term, and it's not a billion-dollar problem. Unlike kind of the cancer moonshot and other diseases, I think this is more of a $150 million problem, which is, I mean, it's a large number, but it's not a number that can't be achieved. And I mean in terms of preclinical basic science research. Pharma will step in and kind of commercialize once there are products and therapeutics that are well on their way to commercialization. But until then, it's really kind of philanthropy and early stage companies where we serve as kind of a market maker for these companies as well. We'll talk about kind of the summit that we're doing next week in New York, but we see ourselves as the market maker, kind of the platform to bring investors and early stage biotech companies together to accelerate progress.
Do you fund private companies too?
We don't. All of our funding goes to research, academic research institutions, but we've built a robust network of about 50 early stage companies, and we connect those companies with our higher capacity donor base, where folks are interested in venture philanthropy opportunities kind of to do well while doing good. So we kind of indirectly facilitate that funding.
So dive into the science a little bit. I mean, you were funding directly. By the way, check out the website. It's got some very, if you're sort of a nerd like me and like to read these studies, but it looks like you're tackling it at these major institutions you're working with major researchers from a number of different, through T cells, like you said, to the microbiome. Where are we with the understanding the science and then getting to treatments?
We're farther along than we were 2 years ago. I still think we have a long ways to go. We don't have diagnostics. We don't have a known cause. And so in any other disease, kind of those are the fundamental building blocks, and we're missing those. We're working towards them, but so far they're not fully formed. In terms of the projects that we're funding, it's a really wide range, and we're tackling it from a variety of angles. Because I think we need to tackle it from a variety of angles. So, for example, we're funding the world's first fecal transplant trial out of Boston Children's Hospital. The FDA recently approved fecal transplants as a standard of care for C. diff, which really paves the way to use FMT in other disease states. And so far, we're funding that study in adult patients and showing really promising early results.
Can you explain what not to get into the weeds here, what that is?
So fecal transplant is basically you take a third-party donor who is screened for a variety of health conditions, and then that donor donates fecal matter. There's one stool bank in the United States in Boston, and so you take these stool samples, and the idea is that you filter them, you sanitize, you liquefy, put the fecal matter in a pill, and then you swallow the pill. And so that's the transplant. That's kind of how the poop gets into another person's body. It is cheap to manufacture, so to speak. And you have third-party donors. And the reason that fecal transplant is quite promising, we actually just got a phase 2 FDA approval about a month or so ago, is the idea is that it's going to reprogram the gut. It has been determined that every food allergic patient is missing one bacterial strain. They could be missing more than one. If we could bottle up that strain and give that strain to everyone, we could call it a day. Unfortunately, that strain is highly unstable. It can't be bottled up so easily. And so you kind of have to think around the edges. How do you reprogram the gut? And that's really what the fecal transplant work is doing. We're funding a project out of the University of Chicago that is a prebiotic. Ideally, it will be an individualized prebiotic, but again, around kind of the gut. A project out of Northwestern looking at the gut barrier integrity. And if you think about kind of when you ingest food and it's making its way through the GI system, once it crosses that barrier, that's what's causing anaphylaxis. Can you redirect traffic, so to speak? Can you get the food to detour in a different way, not cross the barrier, and therefore not cause anaphylaxis? You're not getting rid of the allergy, you're just kind of protecting this barrier integrity from being violated. We're funding a few vaccine-related projects as well. We have an inverse vaccine out of the University of Chicago. If you think about vaccines generally, you get a vaccine so that your body produces antibodies. Well, in a food allergic body, you're producing so many antibodies that you want to shut that down. You kind of want to do the inverse of what's happening, and you want to teach the immune system to do the opposite of what it thinks it should be doing. And so we're funding an inverse vaccine out of a lab that started by actually working on a celiac vaccine and has now moved into a food allergy vaccine. So, I mean, there are other projects that are in the pipeline as well, but we can't keep up with demand. I mean, the exciting news is that there's so much happening on a variety of different angles and perspectives. We're also funding a diagnostic platform out of CHOP, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, affiliated with Penn, which is a novel assay that started with a disease called EOE, eosinophilic esophagitis, which now is more and more prevalent in food allergic children especially. Oral immunotherapy has been kind of the only option for food allergy patients, where you slowly desensitize by microdosing the allergenic food. And so there's now some correlation between OIT and EOE, not necessarily causation, whether it's latent and gets triggered, no one really knows. And so the team at Penn started looking at a new diagnostics platform for EOE and quickly discovered, well, there's crossover application to food allergy. And that's something that's really important about food allergy is, from a commercialization standpoint, there is going to be broad applicability, both kind of in other autoimmune diseases having applicability to food allergy and vice versa. We're just starting a project now where we're repurposing a cancer drug. Repurposing, I think, is really, really fascinating. It's not something that's been done in the food allergy space, with the exception of biologics. Dupixent and Xolair are two biologics for atopic dermatitis and asthma that have been repurposed and are going through trials. But repurposing a drug that is totally unrelated, like cancer, or seemingly unrelated, is novel, and we're really excited about it.
It is. I mean, it's one of those moments, a lot of frustration, but there also is a lot going on. I mean, the whole repurposing drugs movement is fairly new. And so that's fascinating that you're taking advantage of all of that. I mean, and another aspect of patients taking matters in their own hands is just looking at everything. I mean, organized research sometimes gets locked in these silos, and it's sort of, if it's not in that silo, it's hard to, these silos don't communicate very well with each other. And so you can go in and just knock all those down, especially if you have funding. So and it's such a complicated question. So it sounds like, are some of these becoming, I mean, I don't mean to gross everybody out with the fecal transplants, but the reality is that the microbiome is probably, behind a lot of this, right? I mean, there's 17 trillion microbes in your body, and they're constantly changing, and these sudden changes we have in our health are moods. It can actually affect our moods as well. So, that's one, like you say, that could be relatively inexpensive if if it worked, but it needs to be very individualized. But are there therapies out there that are working now? I don't want to talk about your daughter specifically, but people like that. Are there therapies where they really are seeing an improvement?
There's only one FDA drug to date called Palforzia, which is microdosed peanut powder in a capsule. And so that's the only approved therapeutic. It's for one food. It has limited success. Nestle just divested of the investment entirely, which isn't great for the food allergy space. But that's the only FDA-approved therapeutic. And it's one food. And so as I mentioned, because food allergic patients generally are allergic to many, many foods, if you think about it from an FDA standpoint, if we go food by food, we'll be at this for 250 years, right? The FDA right now mandates that the top 9 allergens in terms of prevalence are labeled on food products, and food is very narrowly construed as food. It's not, if you take shampoo or soap or kind of a variety of other non-food, none of that has to be labeled in terms of containing the top 9. When my daughter was first diagnosed, I kind of ransacked my home and went through everything out because I quickly discovered nut oil is in everything or sesame oil is in everything. And so right now there's really just one FDA-approved drug, which is a convenient form of microdosing, which again is oral immunotherapy, has been the only treatment. Many patients don't qualify for OIT for a variety of reasons because their IgE levels are so high that it would be too risky to try to desensitize that patient. And for those who can do OIT, it is grueling. It is incredibly time-consuming. And especially for pediatric population, Palforzia, for example, you have to take it daily. And then you have to rest for 2 to 3 hours following it. And so rest for a child, for otherwise healthy, active children, is next to impossible. So it kind of creates this psychosocial domino effect of a therapy that's not really viable, especially for the pediatric population. And then if you think about the microbiome, there are various theories that the microbiome is basically set for life by age 8, 10, 12. And so as you become an adult, you can still shape the gut, but it becomes more difficult. It's kind of like learning a foreign language, right? When you're young, you can learn a foreign language easily, and then you can still learn a foreign language when you're 70 years old, but it's more difficult for the brain to absorb the linguistic knowledge. Similarly for the gut, kind of in those early years of life, it's much more malleable. And as you get older, it is harder for the gut to absorb those updates, so to speak. And so, yeah, I mean, the treatment options are very, very limited. Oral immunotherapy is not widely available. I mean, it's available in major metropolitan areas, but even in New York at the top research centers, you often have to wait 4 to 6 months between food challenge appointments. You have to kind of challenge a food to even determine whether you can qualify for OIT. And so it's a very long wait list to the extent that it is available. It's really quite limited.
So what about, we talked about diagnosis a little bit, but I mean, there are a lot of new tools, genetic testing, other omics, like the microbiome, metabolomics, others, testing that can be done now. I mean, there's the classic test, like I think, where you go to an allergist and they expose you to all kinds of different foods and, maybe other things too. I remember Fred, when I was growing up, was allergic to paper, like chemicals in paper, not food, but when they took the paper away, he was fine. But how does that work now? Because obviously you have to first understand what you've got. Is that improving, or are you all working on that as well?
We are working on the diagnostics. Blood and skin tests are highly flawed. There's a very high false positive and false negative rate, and so it can be anywhere between 40 and 50% false on either side, which makes it really hard to diagnose. And so the gold standard for diagnosis is a food challenge, which means you go into an allergist office and you eat small amounts of the food, and you're monitored for 5 to 6, I mean, it's generally a 5 to 6 hour appointment. And at the end, you can either tolerate it or not, or you kind of have to stop mid-challenge. It is a very difficult way to get, especially a child diagnosed, right? I mean, an adult is different, but getting a child to go to a doctor's office for 6 hours to try a food that they've been told to never eat and avoid is psychologically really difficult to manage, both for the child and the family. But that's the only thing we've got at this point. So we are working on a new blood diagnostic platform, and ideally we'll have improved diagnostics, but it's really anecdotal evidence where, I mean, I can say from personal experience, yes, my daughter went into anaphylaxis, but other foods where she hasn't gone into anaphylaxis, it's kind of mother's instinct. I mean, that's not really a diagnostic tool, but watching your child, especially because food allergies often start between kind of 12 and 24 months, there's this kind of burst in food allergy onset. Kids can't talk, right? So they can't communicate. And you really have to watch for signs of distress, whether it's breathing or hives or severe eczema or even mild eczema. And the other thing about diagnostics is there's no way to predict the severity of an allergy. And so you could have a mild reaction one day and anaphylaxis the next, or anaphylaxis one day and totally mild the next. And that is unpredictable. So in addition to kind of diagnosing whether or not one has a food allergy, there's no way to properly diagnose the severity of it.
It's a very dynamic process. Yeah, it changes. So if you all want to think about questions, I'm going to open it up in 2 or 3 minutes, but I did want to ask you, you know, how your family is dealing with this, and maybe for other people that have this in their own situations or families, if you had any advice.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. I think creating normalcy for kids is critically important. I mean, the thing about food allergies, they're an invisible, life-threatening disease. It is considered a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and so there are ADA protections that are afforded to food allergic patients, which is really helpful, but it is invisible. And so especially for children in school, nearly 50% of children have been bullied for their food allergy and bullied with the food, right? And so it is especially difficult, but building kind of your own community and network of families who have gone through the first play date, the first birthday party, the first sleepover, the first sleepaway camp experience. You know, I have personally surrounded myself by other food allergy families who are at various kind of future milestones so that I can turn to them for practical advice on how to give my daughter, you know, as normal a childhood as possible. Anxiety is very prevalent in food allergic kids. I mean, debilitating anxiety. Food disorders also often occur, and so having the resources and the community and, of course, you know, the medical care to support a family. I mean, it takes a village, and especially for food allergy, you need kind of if the parents are working outside the home, you need your caregivers to be fully on top of it, paying attention. You're trusting the school, the teachers, the school cafeteria. At every point in the day, you're sending your child out into the world to interact with food. Food should be enjoyable. It's really hard to enjoy food when you have food allergies, especially when you're a kid. And children don't want to talk about it. They're embarrassed by it. And so how do you empower your child to self-advocate from a really young age, I think is critically important, because if they can advocate for themselves, others will take it seriously as well. And you mentioned Michael J. Fox earlier. There are so many celebrities who are affected by food allergy. They have not become celebrity spokespeople for the disease. And that, to me, it's a challenge. I mean, if we could have the celebrities, I mean, I'm outspoken, I'm not a celebrity. And getting the public attention, really, that the disease deserves, we need people to kind of talk about it more openly, more freely. It's not something to be embarrassed by. It is an autoimmune disease, and you know, there's no reason. You've done nothing wrong. The family has done nothing wrong. It's the cards you're dealt, and so now make a difference, and that's what we're looking to do.
I wonder, I mean, it must be so hard. You know, I have 3 kids, they're older, but you know, it's hard enough teaching your kids boundaries. You know, they want to do something and you say no, you know, for whatever reason. and that you as a parent trying to decide what those parameters are. It's hard enough without having a food allergy, but how do you navigate that? I mean, how old is your daughter now?
7.
Okay, so she's definitely in an age, she's pushing boundaries, or would, most 7-year-olds are.
You pick your battles. She has dessert at the start of dinner. That's kind of her reward. She has a safe dessert at home, and it makes it easier. If we're going to a birthday party, she gets extra treats. But you pick your battles because you have to be so strict and vigilant around food allergy. There's just zero room for error, which means that, from a parenting standpoint, you have to give a little bit on other things where you might otherwise want to be super strict about, but you have to pick your battles and make your child feel empowered and that they can advocate, not be embarrassed, make sure that they have good friends who can take care of them even at a very young age. And when they can start to read, my daughter's just starting to learn how to read a label. I was talking to some members of the audience earlier. Adults don't know how to read labels. We make mistakes, and labels often are really hard to read. They're not in plain English. Peanut, the word peanut, can appear on a label at 28 different Latin-derived roots. And so I've memorized 28 words. If you asked me to recite them to you right now, I don't think I could do it, but I could at least visually recognize it. And how could you possibly expect a child who's just learning to read a label if adults struggle? And I struggle to read labels. I oftentimes will look at a label, I'll reread it 10 times to make sure that I've got it right. And if it's not a food product, it doesn't have to be labeled. And so you run the risk, I was mentioning to someone earlier that chapstick, kind of plain lip balm, now has sesame and peanut oil. It didn't a year ago. Why it does, I don't know. And so labels are constantly changing, and you have to read every label every time. Food manufacturers also have a grace period, so if the ingredients change, it might still be on the shelf with the old label, and kind of this gray area of the label hasn't changed, but the ingredients have changed. The sesame labeling law changed on January 1st of this year. Sesame was officially added as a top 9 allergen in the US. It's been in the top list in the EU and Australia and Canada for many, many years. So the US has lagged in the labeling laws. And now sesame, what food manufacturers have done in response to this labeling law change, which is totally legal, is proactively add sesame. It is cheaper to add the ingredient than to create the manufacturing processes to prevent cross-contamination. So there was this awful image that I saw on Facebook in a food allergies support group of a child standing in the aisle of Target, and the bread aisle was empty. You cannot, it's 2023 in America. If you have a sesame allergic child, you can basically not eat bread. You can eat maybe Wonder Bread, but otherwise you can't eat bread, which means you can't eat pastries, or you can't eat a bagel, or, and so on and so forth. And so that's one food. And the labeling law changed, which is good because now it has to be on the label, except that the response has been to let's just add the ingredient and make it that much more difficult for the food allergic community.
Right. The motivations of the food companies are a little different than, than taking care of.
The addressable market is huge, right? And so if we can kind of change the conversation around the patient population is an addressable market, and coupled with the multiplier effect of a household, the financial incentives will start to change.
Yeah. So, do we have questions out there? Hang on for the mic just for a second. There you go.
As any of your researchers you've encountered, how much does this have to do with our bodies and our dependence on sugar, good sugar and bad sugar? Well, years ago, I had tonsillitis. Come to find out years after that, that is because I had a food allergy that I didn't know anything about. But the advice was not to stay away from the food itself, but just that I needed to boost my immune system. That was the advice. How much does this has to do with the fact that our bodies and the dependence we have on sugar, whether it's be through, external McDonald's or Dunkin' Donuts or whatever, or if it's just, natural in sugar. I think sugar has a lot to do with it, our body's dependence on it.
So I'm not aware of specific research on sugar, but in terms of inflammatory foods, I mean, our diet has become much more inflammatory, whether it's sugar, salt, sodium. I mean, there's a variety of ingredients that lead to inflammation, and inflammation generally is not good for the gut. But there is no known kind of dietary preference or effect that correlates with food allergy. There's just now some research being done around maternal diet, prenatal diet, and actually there are some findings that the more diverse the diet, kind of in pregnancy, in utero, the better. But no human being can eat 100 foods, right? Like constantly in rotation. So even the early findings that we're discovering around diet aren't necessarily practical from an implementation standpoint.
Other, boy, a bunch of questions. How about right
Hi, that was really fascinating. Thank you for sharing everything that you did today. I have a question. What are the top foods and how are they related to each other? I have a friend who is allergic to bananas and avocado, and it seems like a lot of my friends that are allergic to bananas are also allergic to avocados. Is there something similar with how they're grown, the fertilizer? Has there been research done behind that?
Yes, so foods have protein structures and foods share protein structures. So mango and cashew are the same protein. So you have a nut and a fruit have the same protein. But it gets more interesting or more complicated when you have a food and a non-food share the same protein. So latex and kiwi are the same protein. Kiwi, banana, and avocado are the same protein. And so there's some correlation between a latex allergy and a food. And there are also cross-reactivity with environmental allergens. So especially for tree nuts and birch, pollen, those types of environmental allergies are highly correlated with tree nuts. And so if tree nuts are consumed in springtime and you have a pollen allergy, your likelihood of a more severe reaction is higher. So foods share proteins. And allergists are starting to discover kind of what those pairings are. Walnut and pecan are the same protein. Sesame and peanut aren't the same protein, but highly similar in protein structure, which is why you see a high correlation of peanut and sesame allergic individuals. But this kind of food, non-food shared protein is the next frontier, and we haven't even figured out the shared food frontier.
Well, you told me before this you weren't a scientist, but you're doing a pretty good job. Yeah.
I mean, as a DC lawyer, you are good. So I lived in DC a long time ago. So this is more of a political and a legal question. In terms of, I'm assuming this is like a bipartisan issue because it affects everybody. But in terms of funding, have you looked at other sources like state and local governments? Because they spend a lot of money on healthcare. Actually, they spend about $2 trillion a year. And have you looked at that avenue in terms of getting funding? Thank you.
We have, it's limited. I mean, it's the awareness, it's the political pressure. It should be a bipartisan issue. I mean, there's not, I mean, anything can be partisan, I suppose, but there's nothing partisan about food or healthcare, but the funding is very limited. 3 out of the past 4 most recent presidents have had food allergic children or had food allergies themselves. And so, if I were president, I would have signed an executive order for a moonshot. The way that President Biden has done for cancer, because his family has obviously been significantly impacted by cancer. And so we had 4 administrations that were affected by food allergy. Nothing happened. And so I think it's a matter of raising awareness. And at the state and local level, the funding has gone more towards stocking epinephrine, for example. It was illegal quite recently to use one EpiPen prescribed to one person for another person, right? And so there was an incident where a school nurse, a child had an anaphylactic reaction, had no known food allergy, and the nurse used another child's EpiPen to save this child's life. She did the right thing that was technically illegal. And so luckily, during the Obama administration, legislation was passed to stock epinephrine. However, if you go on a plane, there's an emergency medical kit, right? So there's a defibrillator on a plane. There is no stock epinephrine. So if you're on a plane and you're 35,000 feet cruising altitude, you could make an injection of epinephrine if you had to. Kind of could break a vial. You can do it chemically, but it's not mandated on U.S. airlines. It is mandated in other parts of the world. So you have airlines that are obviously transatlantic carriers, but because they fly in different airspace, they don't have to carry epinephrine. And there have been quite a few incidents in the past few years of people going into anaphylaxis mid-flight, and if you're not carrying an EpiPen, you're in trouble.
Wow. I mean, the politics of these things can be extraordinary. People are thinking, I mean, special interest groups. But do we have anybody, we have a virtual audience too, and we welcome you all. Do we have any virtual questions out there by any chance? Okay. Maybe one more question? Yeah. Oh, well, actually, we'll have the two here. Oh, yeah.
I think it's really nice that you have your daughter eat dessert before her main meal because she has allergies. My question is about the allergy cures in terms of food allergy, HIV, and drugs. So I think that, is it possible for a cure to reach out to communities, particularly in the homeless services, because I live in a church, and I was admitted to the hospital like 3 times because of an allergic reaction that happened when I ate dinner, breakfast, or lunch, or, a variety of the meals that they serve. And I live with persons in the church who have HIV or are, they chronic drug users. And sometimes I believe they don't know their status with food allergies. And when they take their substances and have foods that are not healthy to their bodies, I think that causes a really devastating situation. My cousin is the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, so I go through seeing these persons with these various situations. And when I did my intake with DHS, they never asked me what my food allergies were. So when I go downstairs and I have meals on a daily basis, if I'm there, to participate in the meals, I don't know what I can be allergic to or not, and nobody else knows it. And so I wanted to know, what is your viewpoint on food allergies as it relates to drugs and diseases? Like, what advice would you give to persons who don't have connections to medical insurance, I would say, to get the examinations? Like, going back into the community, I would love to take your advice and to send an email to the persons that I live with, because there's no kitchen where you can personally cook there and protect your body. So what advice would you give me to communicate to the human resources or the social directors in terms of creating a more healthier lifestyle? Because I have such great experience in nutrition. My daughter is also allergic to various wheat items, and I'm allergic to shellfish. So I have to be very careful when I go out networking and whatnot. What advice would you give to me so that I could communicate to persons to create a more healthier lifestyle for the underprivileged and the homeless? Me being a sous chef, because I work a lot with poverty. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to raising awareness, and I think educating, HR, as you mentioned, kind of others on, at the very least, what are the top 9 allergens, because food allergic reactions have been documented to 170 foods. That's a lot. But the top 9 allergens account for 95% of reactions. You can actually kind of figure out a large amount by just kind of raising awareness of what are those top 9 foods, and then educating folks on what those top 9 foods are, how do you read labels, how do you avoid having those foods in the kitchen. I mean, if you could have a nut-free kitchen, you're probably reducing reactions even farther, because nuts disproportionately lead to I mean, any food can, but nuts account for a significant chunk of that 95%. So I think it's really trying to kind of almost simplify it to say, okay, here are the 9 foods that are going to cause 95% of our problems, and now let's think creatively and partner together to tackle these 9.
Actually, I think we probably are going to wind up here. You'll be around for a few minutes, right? So feel free to talk to Ilana after. And yeah, I mean, we didn't get into the economics of this very much, but accessibility, people who are economically deprived, have other diseases, immunosuppressed people, that's a whole nother area.
And then, I mean, even those, so many people are uninsured, but even those who do have insurance, I can tell you, I have insurance, none of it is covered. And so it's raising awareness with the insurance carriers as well to kind of understand the economic impact and the disproportionate economic impact on those who don't have access to medical care, can't get diagnosed, can't even get emergency medical care.
So maybe we need to get a little more of this, like when I go to a restaurant and they say, do you have any food allergies? Anyway, let's give Ilana a big hand here. Thank you.
Thank you.